Every night, at exactly the same time, a signal appeared on the radio. It didn't come from headquarters. It didn't come from any Allied units positioned along the front. And it definitely didn't come from the enemy. But before I continue, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, comment below, and tell me where you're watching from. You won't believe how this story unfolds was just a voice, quiet, rhythmic, cutting through the endless hiss of static, repeating a seemingly random set of numbers, coordinates. At first, no one believed it meant anything. In a war zone, the airwaves are choked with ghosts, bouncing signals, echoes of old transmissions, encrypted noise that sounds like voices if you listen long enough. But the night they finally decided to check those coordinates, an entire platoon realized something terrifying. That ghostly message had just saved their lives. The bunker was buried deep, small, damp, and suffocating. It was barely large enough for 2 rusted metal desks, a leaning rack of communication equipment, and the heavy, olive-drab radio set that filled the cramped space with a constant, low-frequency hum. Inside, the air was heavy. It smelled of stale sweat, ozone, gun oil, and the bitter dregs of day-old coffee. Outside, the war never really stopped. It was a living, breathing thing. Distant explosions echoed through the jagged hills, shaking the dirt from the reinforced ceiling. Artillery thunder rolled across the night sky like a slow-moving mechanical storm. But inside the bunker, the world shrank down to a single illuminated dial. Everything revolved around the radio. Private Daniel Kovac had been sitting in that metal chair for 11 hours. His back ached. His eyes burned from staring at the glowing green instruments in the dim light. Heavy black headphones were pressed tight against his ears, sealing him off from the physical world and dropping him into the invisible ocean of radio. Frequencies, listening, waiting. Most nights were agonizingly boring. Hours of white noise. Routine, encrypted transmissions that sounded like grinding metal. Monotone updates from weary patrols walking the perimeter. Sometimes a frantic call for supplies. Sometimes bad news, but mostly it was just the endless, empty static. Until one night, it started as a faint crackle. A slight fluctuation in the baseline hum. Barely noticeable. Just another distortion in the sea of noise. But Kovac's hand instinctively reached for the heavy bakelite tuning dial. He adjusted it a fraction of a millimeter. The static parted. The sound grew sharper. Then he heard it. A voice. It was quiet. Unnaturally calm. It didn't have the breathless panic of a soldier under fire, nor the crisp, authoritative bark of a command post. It was steady, flat, repeating the exact same phrase over and over. Grid 7, 4, 9, 2. A pause of exactly 3 seconds. Grid 7, 4, 9, 2. Kovac frowned, leaning closer to the console. He checked the frequency ledger taped to the desk. This channel was dead space. It wasn't a frequency used by his battalion, nor was it recognized by the broader Allied command. He recalibrated the receiver. Trying to clear the distortion, the voice continued, slow, mechanical, emotionless. It offered no call sign, no authentication code, no plea for help, just coordinates. Nothing else. After exactly 4 minutes, the signal cut out. It didn't fade away. It vanished instantly, dropping Kovac right back into the hissing void of dead air. The bunker fell silent again, save for the hum of the generator. Kovac grabbed his grease pencil and scrawled the numbers onto his notepad. 7492. He stared at them for a long time. But exhaustion was setting in, and by the time his relief arrived at dawn, he had almost forgotten about them. The next night, the bunker was exactly the same. The same smell, the same damp cold, the same distant rumble of artillery. Kovac put on his headphones. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. Lacero. The static parted. Grid 1, 0, 5, same frequency, same calm, haunting voice, repeating a new set of numbers. Kovac didn't wait. He unspooled the cord of his headset and grabbed the field telephone, cranking the handle to call his commanding officer. Lieutenant Miller arrived 10 minutes later, wiping sleep from his eyes, his jacket thrown hastily over his undershirt. He took the spare headset and pressed it to his ear. He listened for a full minute, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighed and tossed the headset onto the desk. "It's interference, Kovac," Miller said, rubbing his jaw. "Signal bounce. Atmospheric skip from some abandoned transmitter." "Sir, the voice war zones are full of stray signals. Private. Broken repeaters, looping old tests. Enemy PS ops, trying to clog our nets. Ignore it," Miller left. But Kovac didn't ignore it. He wrote the new numbers down. 8105. 2 days later, the reality of those numbers hit. A specialized Betray team had just returned from a grueling 3-day sweep of the northern sector. They were elite men, accustomed to moving silently through hostile territory, operating far beyond the wire. They walked into the mess tent covered in dried mud, their faces hollow from lack of sleep. Kovac was sitting at a corner table. During a casual exchange with one of the Pathfinders, he mentioned the strange radio interference and the random numbers. The Pathfinder stopped eating. His spoon slowly lowered to his tray. "Wait," the soldier said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What were those first coordinates?" "Exactly. Asterisk grid 7492, Kovac replied. The soldier's face went entirely pale. He looked at his squad leader across the table. The squad leader stood up, walked over to Kovac, and grabbed his arm. "Where did you get those numbers?" the sergeant demanded. "From the radio." "3 nights ago. Why?" "Because those coordinates were the exact location of a narrow ravine their patrol had almost used as a shortcut that very morning that had altered their route at the last possible second because of a washed-out bridge. Later, artillery spotters confirmed that the ravine wasn't empty. It was a densely packed, unmapped anti-personnel minefield. If they had taken that shortcut, the entire squad would have been wiped out. No warning, no chance to survive. The realization spread through the camp like a virus. The mysterious signal hadn't been random. It had broadcast the coordinates of a lethal threat. Days before Allied boots ever reached the dirt dot, the atmosphere in the communications bunker changed entirely. It was no longer a lonely outpost. The next night, Kovac wasn't alone. Lieutenant Miller was there. The patrol sergeant was there. An intelligence officer from Battalion Command stood in the corner, chain-smoking cigarettes. Everyone was staring at the clock. 23:58. 23:59, Lacero, the radio crackled. The static dropped. Grid 6, 3, 3, 1. The intelligence officer immediately unrolled a topographical map across the rusted desk. He traced his finger along the grid lines, stopping at a dense cluster of contour rings. "That's the Whisper Valley," the officer said quietly. Command is sending an armored column through there tomorrow at 0600. Miller looked at the map. Are you sure? That's the grid, the officer confirmed. They didn't wait this time. By 0200, an elite reconnaissance unit was moving out into the pitch black, utilizing night vision optics to navigate the treacherous, rain-slicked terrain. They reached the edge of Whisper Valley just before sunrise. The terrain was dead silent. A thick fog rolled through the base of the canyon. It looked completely clear, but as the recon team crawled forward through the wet brush, their optics picked up heat signatures, hidden artillery, heavily fortified, camouflaged anti-tank positions dug deep into the rock face. A kill box. It was a perfectly laid ambush, waiting for the armored column to roll into the valley and get utterly decimated. The recon unit radioed back. The armored advance was halted. A strike was called in. If that radio signal hadn't broadcast those numbers at midnight, an entire company of armor would have burned in that valley. When the recon team returned, the mood at the base was electric with tension. The signal had predicted danger. Not once, twice, exactly. And the voice kept repeating the pattern. Every single night. At midnight. Always leading to a trap, an ambush, or a hazard. Now, Command wanted answers. Who was out there? Who had this kind of deep penetration intel on enemy movements? And why were they broadcasting it in the clear on an unused frequency? Radio technicians were brought in. They spent days scanning the spectrum, analyzing the sine waves of the transmission, trying to triangulate the source. The signal was incredibly weak. It was a ghost of a transmission, barely pushing enough wattage to crest the mountains. But they managed to get a vector. It was coming from the east, from Sector 4. The intelligence officer stared at the triangulated map, shaking his head. That's impossible. Sector 4 was a dead zone. It had been heavily bombarded during the first month of the war and completely abandoned by both sides. It was considered toxic, impassable, a wasteland of craters and ruined concrete. But old pre-war maps showed something buried in that sector. An old, obsolete communications relay station built into the side of a mountain. Command assumed it had been destroyed in the initial bombings, but the signal kept coming. Every night, the same calm, unwavering voice, repeating numbers that continued saving lives. They had to know. A specialized team was assembled, heavily armed, carrying weeks of rations, and tasked with penetrating deep into the gray zone to find the ghost. Broadcaster. The journey took 3 agonizing days. They moved through landscapes that looked like the surface of the moon. Splintered forests, ash-choked rivers, ruined, skeletal villages where the silence was so heavy it rang in their ears. Finally, they reached the coordinates. The hill where the old relay station once stood. From a distance, Command's assessment seemed correct. The facility looked completely annihilated. The thick concrete walls had caved in. The massive steel antenna tower had snapped in half, its twisted metal resting against the cliff face like a broken spine. Rust and grey dust covered everything. There were no footprints, no signs of recent movement, no heat signatures. The squad leader signaled his men to fan out. Weapons raised, they approached the ruins. As they slipped through a blast hole in the exterior wall, the heavy silence of the dead zone shifted. One of the point men raised a fist. Halting the squad, he tilted his head. Beneath the wind blowing through the broken concrete, there was a sound. A faint, vibrating hum. Electrical. They moved deeper into the dark, subterranean levels of the facility. The air grew stale, thick with dust and the smell of ancient diesel fuel. They reached a reinforced steel door at the end of a collapsed corridor. It was jammed half open. Inside, they found the source. The room was pitch black, save for the dull amber glow of vacuum tubes and instrument panels. A massive, archaic military radio set was bolted to the wall. Beside it, an old diesel generator was weakly chugging away, drawing from an underground auxiliary tank, somehow still running after all this time. Connected to the radio was a modified tape spool recording device. The reels were slowly spinning. The radio was still powered, still transmitting. They had found the broadcast. But they had also found the broadcaster, slumped over the metal desk. His hand still resting near the transmission key was a skeleton. He was wearing the tattered, dust-covered remains of an Allied uniform. The insignia identified him as a forward observer, part of a unit that had been declared missing in action months ago. During the chaotic opening weeks of the war, the squad moved into the room in absolute silence. The only sound was the clicking of the tape reels and the low thrum of the generator. The squad leader stepped up to the desk. Beside the skeletal remains lay a thick, leather-bound notebook. The sergeant gently opened it. The pages were filled with frantic, meticulously detailed handwriting. It was a logbook reading through the entries. The story of the ghost broadcaster revealed itself. The soldier had been part of an advanced scouting element that was overrun. He had managed to fall back and barricade himself inside this abandoned relay station. From this high vantage point, using the station's surviving optics, he had spent weeks observing the enemy. He watched them lay the minefields. He mapped their hidden artillery batteries. He documented their ambush points and supply routes. He wrote down every single coordinate, but he had been severely wounded during his escape. The early entries in the journal were sharp and professional. The later entries became erratic, detailing his failing strength, his infection, the realization that no rescue was coming. He was trapped. He was going to die in this concrete tomb. But he had all this intelligence. He knew that eventually, Allied forces would push into this sector, and they would walk directly into the traps he was looking at. He couldn't leave. But his voice could dot in his final days, fighting off fever and exhaustion. He managed to repair the primary transmitter. He rigged the auxiliary generator, and then he recorded his voice onto the magnetic tape, slicing the tape, looping it, programming the archaic broadcast timer to activate at midnight every night. To preserve the fading power of the generator, he set the machine to broadcast the coordinates of the deadliest traps. One by one, the final entry in the notebook was written in a shaky, barely legible hand. Power failing, body failing. The tape will run as long as the fuel lasts. Do not walk blindly into the dark. I am leaving the lights on for you. The squad leader stood over the desk for a long time. He looked at the tape reels, spinning endlessly in the dim amber light. He reached out, resting his hand gently on the shoulder of the fallen soldier's uniform. He didn't turn off the radio. He ordered his men to copy down every coordinate remaining in the notebook. Then they secured the soldier's dog tags, left the room, and began the long trek back to Allied lines. The generator eventually ran out of fuel. The signal eventually faded into the static forever. But by the time it did, it had guided thousands of men safely through the dark. Sometimes, the most powerful voice in war doesn't come from a general. or a politician, or a commander giving orders. Sometimes, the loudest voice comes from someone who is no longer there, a ghost in the static, a man who refused to let his brothers die long after his own war was over.